My name is Kim Barberi, and I'm the education specialist here at the library. I must say it has been so gratifying to have such large audiences these past few days. I'm thinking we need to do D-Day every day. Well, maybe not, but you know. As we commemorate the 70th anniversary of D-Day, we do it with the knowledge of what D-Day is and why it ranks as a seminal event in history. It is appropriate, absolutely so, that we recognize and honor the generation that fought and won World War II at such great sacrifice. But even that is not enough. We owe them even more, an enduring legacy for all time. Imbuing upcoming generations with a meaningful understanding of D-Day and World War II is essential if this chapter of history is to remain alive in our national memory. The history of World War II is captured beautifully in the exhibits, programs, and special events of World War II Remembered, Leaders, Battles, and Heroes. But what we must ensure is that we carry its significance and its lessons forward, far into the future. Preparing our educators to teach about it and harnessing methods that truly impact student learning must be a priority. And we are doing our part here at the Eisenhower Presidential Library. For the next week, we have a group of 19 very dedicated, very bright teachers here at the library for the first of what will be a series of 3 World War II Remembered annual workshops. We're delighted to have this group with us this afternoon, and I would ask for them to stand so we may recognize them. And teachers, thank you for your interest in World War II and for your commitment to teaching the next generation about it. And now for our keynote speaker, who, by the way, is the featured historian at our teacher workshop next week. He writes with insight, passion, and a great grasp of history. One of the best military historians on either side of the Atlantic. The story is told with great intelligence and sympathy. He writes books that you want to read. These are only a few of the many examples of the high praise earned by this afternoon's keynote speaker, Nigel Hamilton. We are so grateful to have him here with us today to mark this special D-Day anniversary. Professor Hamilton is a senior fellow in the McCormick Graduate School at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. He is the author of an impressive and a very, very long list of books, many of them multi-volume works and most of them biographies, for which he has a singular passion. His first major biography, The Brother's Man, was published in 1978, followed 3 years later by Monty, The Making of a General, 1887-1942, the first in a 3-volume work. American presidents have long been a subject of Professor Hamilton's research and writing. He authored the critically acclaimed JFK Reckless Youth, which inspired the television miniseries. Former President Bill Clinton was the focus of a 2-volume biography, and American Caesars, Lives of the Presidents from Franklin D. Roosevelt to George W. Bush, examines 12 U.S. presidents. Professor Hamilton's keen interest in biography led to the founding of Biography Publishers and the Biography Bookshop in the mid-'80s. Through his efforts, the British Institute of Biography and the first Center for Biography in Britain, the Biorama Project, was established. 2 of his books reflect his great enthusiasm for the study of biography. Biography, A Brief History, and also How to Do Biography, a Primer. Not only has he written or co-written, by my count, at least 25 books, but Professor Hamilton has won numerous awards for his writing, among them the Whitbread Award for Biography and the Templar Medal for Best Contribution to Military History. Today, British-born Nigel Hamilton is an American citizen. and his most recent work, The Mantle of Command, FDR at War, 1941-1942, was released on May 13th. It is conveniently available in our gift shop. I know I am looking forward to reading that. Please join me in welcoming our D-Day 70th anniversary keynote speaker, Nigel Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Kim, for that charming introduction. And although I am now an American citizen, I hope you will forgive my lingering British accent. I called my talk D-Day 70 years ago. And I begin by saying that yesterday, on the 70th anniversary of D-Day, President Obama traveled to Normandy as our nation's head of state and the U.S. Commander-in-Chief, the Commander-in-Chief of our armed forces, which is only right and proper, for the number of veterans who took part in those historic landings is diminishing by the day, and we want to honor their courage as well as the supreme sacrifice of those who never came back alive. When I was asked to visit with you here in Abilene at the Eisenhower Presidential Library, I felt deeply honored. As a recently naturalized American, it is for me an especial privilege, for I have a special connection with D-Day. My father took part in the D-Day invasion, becoming the youngest British infantry battalion commander in the Normandy battle at the age of only 25. And my childhood summers thereafter were spent camping in the region, Normandy, where so many of my father's men lost their lives. 600 of his men became casualties in the great battle that followed the landings, out of 1,000. From Normandy, my father went on to fight in Belgium, Holland, and Germany, as the Allies pursued President Roosevelt's goal of the unconditional surrender of the forces of Nazi Germany. Later, I got to know quite intimately Field Marshal Montgomery, the general who had commanded the Allied land forces at D-Day, and the man who took the surrender of all German forces in Holland, northwest Germany, and Denmark on May the 4th, 1945, less than 11 months after D-Day. And was even taken by Monty to spend a weekend with his hero, Winston Churchill, who had been Prime Minister at the time of the D-Day landings. A very extraordinary privilege for a 19-year-old university student, I can tell you. Later still, I was appointed official biographer of the Field Marshal in 3 volumes. And I was able to interview many hundreds of surviving US and British commanders in the Normandy campaign, from paratroop commanders such as Generals Max Taylor and Jim Gavin, to corps and divisional commanders such as Lightning Joe Collins and Brian Horrocks, and their staff officers, military aides and men, American, British, and Canadian, all serving under the Supreme Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. It was an unforgettable experience to assemble in retrospect the story of the largest amphibious invasion that will probably ever take place in human history. It brought me here to Abilene many years ago in the 1980s to do research in the library's papers and in many other United States libraries and archives. When it was all over in 1988, however, I felt I should move on, and I did, becoming a presidential historian, not only writing new biographies of President John F. Kennedy and Bill Clinton, but as Kim said, a group biography of the last 12 United States presidents, from FDR through Dwight Eisenhower to George W. Bush, American Caesars, which was published in 2010. Can everybody hear?
Yeah.
Now you can. But none of what I've said really matters. Now it matters. It was the writing of American Caesars that alerted me to the fact, though, that no one had ever chronicled President Roosevelt's life as United States Commander-in-Chief. That is, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the United States in World War II. From the Commander-in-Chief's perspective in his Oval study, his Oval office, his map room, his Maryland camp, Shangri-La, which later became Camp David, his house at Hyde Park, and his travels across the nation and abroad, to Newfoundland, to Africa, Casablanca, Cairo, Tunis, Tehran, Pearl Harbor, to the Middle East and Yalta. And that seemed to me, given the importance of President Roosevelt's role in World War II, wrong. So, for the past 5 years, I've had another privilege, to revisit the life of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in World War II in 2 volumes. Not only to record really for the first time the President's role as United States Commander-in-Chief, but to set the record straight. In fact, to change history, if we understand by that the way we look at the past. And especially with regard to the D-Day landings in June 1944. For the simple truth is, most people have very, very little idea of the origins of D-Day. The story of how President Roosevelt personally directed the military so that D-Day would be a triumph, not mass suicide. Let me explain briefly, which is pretty hard for somebody who writes in multiple volumes. In 1942, in the somewhat panic-stricken weeks after Pearl Harbor, a time when a young Major General Eisenhower working in the War Department was trying vainly to put together the ships that would be needed to rescue his former boss, General MacArthur, in the Philippines. The President of the United States took the reins not only of U.S. Commander-in-Chief in wartime, but of the Western Allies. Whatever you may have read or seen of the performance of Winston Churchill in 1942, let me tell you that Churchill's role was, as Churchill admitted publicly later that year in November of 1942, he was only the President's, quote, ardent lieutenant. It was the President of the United States who determined the strategy of the Allies. And Roosevelt began this with a decision of historic importance, namely to pursue a policy of Germany first, not Japan first. Defeating Japan first would still leave Hitler in control of Europe, the President maintained. Whereas defeating Hitler first would make it then impossible for Japan to hold out for more than a few months. And so, bucking public opinion and media commentary, the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the United States focused on dealing with Nazi Germany as America's first priority. Easier said than done, however. The British Empire in the Far East collapsed that spring, and the United States was expected to save Australia on its own without British help. Even British forces in Egypt, defending the Suez Canal and access to the Middle East, found themselves trounced by Field Marshal Rommel. Over 30,000 British troops surrendering Tobruk on June 21, 1942, without a fight. As Churchill, who was visiting President Roosevelt in Washington at the time, later wrote, it was, quote, a bitter moment. Defeat is one thing, disgrace is another. The difficulty for the president was not only the collapse of British forces across the world, but the cuckoo plans of the president's own generals and admirals in Washington, as I've described in the mantle of command. Honorable men in Washington with no idea of military reality in confronting Hitler's Wehrmacht in battle. The Secretary of War, Colonel Henry Stimson, the Chief of Staff of the United States Army, General George Marshall, and the entire complement of generals and admirals in the War and Navy departments in Washington thus called for an immediate Allied invasion of northern France, a so-called Second Front. Either that year, 1942, or latest in the spring of 1943, the most direct route to Berlin and defeat of the Third Reich. How such senior officers in Washington could have given their president and commander-in-chief such advice today is almost beyond comprehension. But they did. And when President Roosevelt said no, we have never fired a single shot against a single German soldier yet in this war. We must first gain combat experience. They came close to mutiny, as I've tried to describe in the mantle of command. The Secretary of War of the United States telling the President of the United States that the President's alternative plan, which was to launch an amphibious invasion of Northwest Africa, at the bottom of the map there, to save the British after Tobruk, and to learn how to fight the Germans in real battle at the furthest extremity of German lines of communication and knock Italy out of the war. They bet their own president the plan would fail. In fact, Secretary Stimson took a bet with the President of the United States that his invasion, codenamed Torch, would fail, and asked General Marshall whether, if he was made dictator of America, he would cancel the President's great pet scheme, as Stimson called it, for landings in Northwest Africa instead of a second front. And Marshall said yes, he would. He would cancel Torch. How President Roosevelt faced down his generals and insisted they carry out his North African plan, Torch, instead of committing mass American suicide on the beaches of northern France in 1942 and again in 1943, is one of the most dramatic episodes in American history, and one with a happy ending, for Torch did not fail. president chose General Eisenhower, young President Eisenhower, to be its commander-in-chief. And the landings on November the 8th, 1942, the Torch invasion, proved a brilliant success, stunning Hitler and giving hope to millions of people across occupied Europe that the Americans are coming. You see the landings marked in blue arrows on the North African coast there at the bottom of your map. How disastrous a cross-channel invasion would have been if the generals and admirals in Washington had had their way had already been demonstrated in August that year, 1942. When Winston Churchill authorized a mini D-Day invasion targeted at a little French seaport south of the Pas-de-Calais called Dieppe. It's not actually marked on the map, but it's somewhat above the blue arrow, southeast of Dover. A brigade of Canadian troops who had never been in battle before were landed on Dieppe's pebbled shore on August the 19th, 1942. Almost 1,000 were slaughtered in cold blood without ever getting off the beaches, despite the tanks that had landed with them. And Hitler was delighted, saying to Goebbels, his propaganda minister, that General Sepp Dietrich, his favorite SS commander, would be furious that he hadn't even had the time to get to Dieppe before the enemy was wiped out. The Canadians taking over 60% casualties that morning. President Roosevelt, in other words, had been proven right and his generals wrong. And the same thing happened then in 1943, a few months later. But with the British now giving the president grief. At Casablanca in January 1943, the president had wonderfully silenced his Washington generals who were criticizing Eisenhower for being slow to seize Tunisia, where large numbers of German troops had been flown into combat. The president of Casablanca had made clear he was not in the least disappointed by General Eisenhower's slow progress in Tunisia. This was exactly why US forces were in the Mediterranean, not northern France, namely to learn how to fight and gradually how to defeat the Wehrmacht in modern battle. At Kasserine, the following month, the president was swiftly proven right. Defeat at German hands was shocking, but not shameful. North Africa was an opportunity to learn the lessons of combat, of command, and of coalition cooperation, army, air, and navy, fighting together with allies. In the ensuing months of 1943, in Tunisia and Sicily, we heard a very moving story just half an hour ago about those invasions. United States forces did exactly that. Learn how to defeat Wehrmacht forces in battle, instead of launching a cross-channel invasion where Hitler had over 25 divisions waiting for us to assault the beaches or the ports, that would have failed at that time before United States troops had had time to become battle-hardened. as United States forces, including young General Eisenhower himself, learned those tough lessons, the President laid down the further strategy the Allies would follow. 1943 would, in the Mediterranean, provide the field and amphibious experience US forces needed in 1943. The spring of 1944 would, he got everyone to agree, then be the right moment for D-Day. A moment when US mass production, and we've heard of Rosie the Riveter, that home front, when US mass production of planes, tanks, and ships would make it logistically feasible, and a moment by which the United States would have the requisite combat and command experience gained in the Mediterranean theater and coalition experience that would ensure the troops themselves had a good chance of succeeding in a venture which, after all, even Hitler had not dared to undertake, even at the height of his victories in 1940. It was at that point that Churchill, yet again, came to Washington in May 1943 on board the Queen Mary with 160 staffers ensconced in the staterooms that were specially rebuilt on the liner, which had become a troop ship. Why did he come? He came to persuade the President, if possible, to dump the D-Day invasion in 1944 in favor of more Mediterranean ventures, or if not, at least to postpone D-Day until 1945 or 1946. 1945 or 1946, the President, who had been told in December of 1942 already that already 2 million Jews and other people had been exterminated by the Germans in camps. 1945 or 1946, the President in May 1943 can be forgiven for having gotten pretty fed up with Winston. And he read Churchill, as he put it to a friend, the Riot Act. Combat-hardened divisions, including commanders like General Bradley and Patton, would, he made clear to Churchill, have to be withdrawn from the Mediterranean as soon as Sicily was in Allied hands. They were to be sent to Britain to be the spearhead of the D-Day invasion set for May the 1st, 1944, latest, period. Churchill didn't know what had hit him. He thought Mr. Roosevelt must be ill. Have you noticed that the President is a very tired man? His mind seems closed. He seems to have lost his wonderful elasticity, Churchill complained to his doctor. In truth, the President was in perfectly good health, just tired of Churchill's continual attempts to evade the agreement that had been made. United States forces had, after all, saved the British in North Africa and were now ready to launch a long-awaited second front that would lead to Berlin. He did not want a fruitless diversion of effort in the Mediterranean or the Aegean, on the other side of Italy, or in the Balkans, and saw no reason why the United States should agree to such a cancellation or postponement. The President then stood firm. Not only was serious planning begun for the D-Day landings, codenamed Overlord, but the President began to think more carefully who should command them. given Churchill's obstructionism amounting to cross-channel defeatism, the President rejected the initial idea of a British Supreme Commander. But if it was to be an American Supreme Commander, who should it be? It was at that point in the summer and fall of 1943 that President Roosevelt began to question the assumption, which everyone had, that the Supreme Commander should be General Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the United States Army. Marshall, after all, was the man who had opposed the President over the Torch invasion, fearing it would fail, while pressing for an assault on northern France that definitely would have failed. Moreover, Marshall had further disappointed the President by becoming deeply anxious lest the Germans magically invade Spain, cross the Mediterranean from Italy and Sicily, invade Spain, come through Spain, cross the Mediterranean, and strike Eisenhower's forces in the flank through Spanish Morocco. That's what Marshall was so frightened of, and kept an entire American army waiting for that possibility, a prospect, a German invasion through Spanish Morocco, which the President thought absurd. In short, for all his administrative ability as Chief of Staff of the United States Army, Marshall did not inspire the President with the confidence that he would make a great Supreme Commander in the field of battle. Marshall could be stiff and formal. Not even the President was encouraged to address him as George. But above all, he could be obstinate and lacking in good judgment. Good judgment. It was this ability that Roosevelt sought in choosing a Supreme Commander for Overlord. Month after month, he held off the appointment of a Supreme Commander, leaving the invasion planning to be done by a Chief of Staff to the Supreme Commander designate, Cossack, which was not ideal, in fact, downright embarrassing when Stalin at Tehran, at the big summit in Tehran in November, asked who would command Overlord on behalf of the Allies. But still and all, better than appointing the wrong man. And in the end, after meeting General Eisenhower in Iran and Tunis and Cairo in November, and we have some. Here he is at Cairo. Here he is, actually, this is mislabeled. This is when he's visiting and he meets General Eisenhower at Casablanca. That's a photo at Rabat, in fact, in January of 1943. And here he is again in Tunis in December, so he was meeting him again and again in the field. Finally, on his way back from his summit, the President's summit with Marshal Stalin, the President told Eisenhower once he was seated beside him in the car, "Well, Ike, Tim, our esteemed Deputy Director of this great museum, may question the actual wording, as any good historian should, but we believe that the President said, 'Well, Ike, you are going to command Overlord.'" He'd already informed Stalin and Churchill, and also the President had informed General Marshall, who had accepted the President's decision with his trademark sang-froid, though deeply disappointed. The President met with Eisenhower another 3 times in Washington over Christmas, or rather New Year of 1944. in Washington when Ike was more or less ordered home to take a rest from his responsibilities before undertaking command of the D-Day invasion forces. The president, Ike found, was quite certain D-Day would be a success. And the president wanted really to talk about the end of the war, unconditional surrender by the Germans, and the best way to administer Germany in the aftermath, as well as the French while the war lasted. And also the setup for a United Nations organization using the United States as one of the world's 4 policemen on behalf of the UN to ensure that no Third Reich or Empire of Japan or madman ever brought the world near to destruction again. It was clear to Eisenhower that the president was a man who thought always ahead, and perhaps it was the key to his genius for leadership, though tempered by almost incredible patience in ensuring unity of Allied purpose, and ensuring that by an almost invisible iron will, that the president's strategy for the military conduct of World War II was followed. These were qualities that Eisenhower had grown over the previous 2 years of war to admire in the president and to some extent to emulate. If one looks for a model for Dwight Eisenhower's own later presidency, it is surely in the way he personally witnessed President Franklin Roosevelt manage the dual role of the U.S. President and U.S. Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the United States. Especially in the way the President refused to be pressured by his military advisors, or even his civilian advisors, into unsound operations of war. President Eisenhower's ending of the Korean War and his refusal to go along with Britain, France, and Israel over Suez in 1956 would demonstrate how much he, Eisenhower, had learned that a commander's sound judgment is far, far more important than fantasies of easy victory or declarations of mission accomplished. We thus honor the triumph of D-Day this weekend, not simply as a testament to the courage of men and women like my father, or your fathers, or grandfathers, uncles, and relatives who took part in the invasion and Battle of Normandy 70 years ago. We honor it also as a testament to the calm, visionary judgment of a great president and commander-in-chief who directed the military in World War II far, far more intelligently, diligently, commandingly than most of us have been led to recognize. A man who delayed his choice of the supreme commander to lead the Allied forces in that momentous enterprise because he wanted the choice to be the right one, a choice worthy of the hundreds of thousands of American servicemen who would be risking and, if necessary, giving their lives to fulfill the President's Germany First policy. D-Day, the invasion which, as Hitler acknowledged, would decide the war. As it did, leading not only to the defeat of Hitler's forces in the West, but which led, under General Eisenhower's leadership, to the final, unconditional surrender of the German armed forces 11 months after D-Day. Thank you very much. questions, impersonations. I did stay with Winston Churchill for a whole weekend. I am told the last person outside the Churchill family to have stayed with Sir Winston, and it was an unforgettable experience. Field Marshal Montgomery, whom I'd got to know very, very well, took me there. I was a student at Cambridge University, and my landlady called me and said, "Nigel, there's somebody on the telephone who says he's Field Marshal Montgomery. I think it's one of your stupid friends." But it wasn't. It was Monty himself, who was retired, but who loved and admired Churchill and felt every year he had to go and stay with Winston and Clemmy to cheer the old boy up. And so he elected to take me with him, and it was, as I say, an unforgettable experience. The high point of which was when Monty, during a pause in the conversation, because somebody was asking me this afternoon, whether Monty was as sort of stiff and difficult as he's often seen in military and literature. And I said, no, he was a very, actually quite entertaining and provocatively entertaining man who actually liked to poke fun wherever he could, whenever he could, especially with younger people. And so at one point during the dinner, as Winston had speared a piece of, his wife had cut this roast venison, actually I'd never had eaten before in my life, but his wife, Clemmy, had cut up the venison into pieces, and I remember Churchill spearing one piece and holding it up and looking at it, with his whiskey glass nearby as well, and deciding which one he would take. And at that moment, there was this pause in the conversation, and Monty leaned over and said into Churchill's ear, because Churchill was pretty hard of hearing by then, he said, "Of course you know, Winston, Nigel's a socialist." Which to the Conservative former Prime Minister was. And Churchill, bless him, looked again at the piece of venison, then looked at me, and then went, "Grrr." But please.
We have a question right here. Actually, if you could repeat his question.
Sure.
This mic is not posting.
So make it a short question so I can repeat it.
I've always been amazed at how the British people fired Churchill shortly after the war, only to become Prime Minister again. Could you speak to that?
Our audience member asked why the British people tossed Churchill out of government in 1945, shortly after the German surrender, but before the Japanese surrender. I think that there isn't a short answer, but I think the shortest I can give is that Churchill was very old-fashioned. I mean, much as I still admire Sir Winston, the mantle of command is pretty critical of Churchill, because I think Churchill was very old-fashioned. He had served in India in 1898, and yet he was absolutely determined that in the 1940s, even as Japanese forces were getting closer and closer to India, I think we even have a map here. Do we have a map? Yes, we have an earlier map. Yes, that one here. As the Japanese had conquered pretty much all of Southwest Pacific, and they'd really reached the borders of India, and the president pleaded with Winston Churchill to allow the Viceroy of India to authorize the Indians to form their own government, self-government, so that the Indians would fight with the British. And Winston Churchill absolutely refused. And when the president sent his right-hand man, Harry Hopkins, to London to try and persuade Winston, Winston said to the aide, Harry Hopkins, if the president pushes me 1 inch further, I shall resign. He was determined. He kept probably over 100,000 troops in India to keep the people of India down from getting self-government rather than facing the Japanese. And in fact, until late 1944 and 1945, the British did nothing in the Pacific. And that's why I say President Roosevelt really had to defend and look after Australia and New Zealand and the South Pacific on his own without British help, entirely because Winston was an old-fashioned colonial imperialist. And when he came to write his memoirs, wonderful memoirs, anybody who I'm sure would agree who's read them, and anybody who hasn't should, because Churchill wrote 6 volumes of memoirs, absolutely wonderfully written. They won him the Nobel Prize for Literature. But Churchill sweeps all that under the carpet. Churchill basically was defending civilized values in a wonderful way, with tremendous rhetoric and brilliance. I mean, his ability to invent metaphors just off the top of his head. I'm sure you know many of them, but one that comes to mind is when he did force the president to put American troops into southern Italy, and when they were slow, he said that they were intended to move much faster, not slowly, like a harvest bug. I mean, who else but Churchill could have come up with a harvest bug for American forces in Italy? I mean, so basically, Churchill had very little vision of the future, and although to some degree in this country he is honoured politically as somebody who saw more realistically the danger of Stalin and Russian communism and so forth, I think that's very overplayed. The president was quite clear exactly what Stalin was up to and what was in Stalin's mind and the future. But to come back to your point, the British public wanted somebody who would talk about the future of society, of democratic society in Britain, a New Deal, if you like, for Britain. They wanted a proper Obamacare. In 1945, they felt that they'd been fighting. People like my dad, who never went to college, came from a working class background. They felt that, they deserved better from the country they had served and fought for. And so the opposing party, the Labour Party, offered a much more visionary idea of British society with a safety net, social security and medical care. And Churchill was simply blind to it. He assumed that out of loyalty to his leadership, the British would re-elect him, and they didn't. So.
Yes, I've never been able to get my arms around how 2 small countries, Japan and Germany, took on the entire world in a protracted war and have the staying power to do that.
That is a very interesting question. How could the Germans and the Japanese, in forming the Axis Pact with the support of Italy, how could they have had such hubris, really, to imagine that they could take on the rest of the world and defeat them? It's a complex question. The simplest answer is that they didn't think they could do it in a long war because the United States was so potentially economically powerful. But the United States had gone through years of isolationism. The United States armed forces were ranked 17th in the world at that time. A lot of the equipment was very outdated. And so they felt that if they struck quickly and efficiently, just as Hitler had in Poland in 1939, and then in the spring of 1940 in Holland and Belgium and France and Norway, that they could wrap it up very quickly. And they did. I mean, just think how quickly I think that is a very good map and shows the extent of Japan's conquests by the spring. I can't see the caption, but I think it's pretty much by the spring of 1942. So blitzkrieg and rampage in the Pacific on a very strict timetable of get it done, don't wait, the democracies are slow, they're not ready, explains why they thought they could get away with it. And, they came quite close to doing it. There's a lady at the back who we want to be gender equal.
Okay. Returning to your comment on Churchill in India. Now, what I had read, Churchill's argument was, which is probably made up, that he didn't, his fear of Indian self-government was partly motivated by the fact that he felt sure that the Indians would condemn the 60 million untouchables to remain untouchable, or is that just garbage?
It's not entirely garbage. Your question is, what was Churchill's fear of Indian self-government because he thought that there would be internal strife, and when the Japanese were getting so close to India, they had their navy in the Indian Ocean and they were approaching the land borders of India, that the British couldn't afford the danger, the military danger to losing India. It's not garbage, but I think the simple fact is Winston Churchill had not been in India since 1898. And I've looked through the correspondence that Churchill had with the Viceroy of India at the time, Lord Linlithgow. And I've looked through the correspondence which Churchill's ambassador to the United States, Lord Halifax, had with Lord Linlithgow, the Viceroy. I won't embarrass you, but I've put it either in the text or in a footnote, because some of the things that the Viceroy of India writes to the British ambassador in Washington in 1942 really makes you feel, certainly makes me ashamed to have been British. Churchill, in his memoirs, simply blamed Gandhi. Well, yes, Gandhi was unrealistic, he was a great spiritual leader, but Gandhi wasn't running the Congress Party. Jawaharlal Nehru was running the party and had the support of Muslims. And the last thing I'd say about that is, if Churchill was right and that it was better not to give the Indian self-government in 1942, how come Singapore was surrendered to the Japanese after only a few days? Over 100,000 British Empire troops surrendered, which included, I think, something approaching 60,000 Indians who were really mercenaries of the British, and over 40,000 of those Indians immediately offered to fight with the Japanese in order to get control of their own country. And one of the things that I so admire, and it is a sort of central moment in this book, is what happens in February of 1942 when word comes in from MacArthur to the White House, and it's a signal from MacArthur saying that the president of the Philippines, because the Philippines was still American territory, the president of the Philippines would like to surrender or negotiate with the Japanese, and you, Mr. President, must make the decision. But he sort of intimated that he thought possibly it was a good idea that the Philippine government should surrender and that way spare themselves from more casualties. This was during the Japanese advance down the Bataan Peninsula, and General MacArthur was on the island of Corregidor with the President of the Philippines. And it's an extraordinary moment, another one of these great deciding moments of the war, not just militarily, but morally. And the President says, no, you, President Quezon, and you, General MacArthur, are not allowed to negotiate anything with the Japanese. If we negotiate with the Japanese at this point, the whole of the Pacific is lost and we'll never triumph. The fact is, American troops, this is what he says in his cable, the American troops are fighting with Filipinos to preserve the independence, the future independence, which has been guaranteed by an act of Congress in 1934 to take place in 1946. We are there not as a colonial oppressor, we are there to ensure that Filipinos can have freedom and independence of the United States in 1946. We're proud of what we've done in this country. You will not negotiate with the Japanese and become simply a vassal state in the Pacific. And to his credit, General MacArthur accepted that and explained it to President Quezon, and Quezon was very upset because he couldn't bear the idea of the suffering that would probably follow, but he accepted it. And that is the origins of what Tim said earlier, the I shall return. We might not be able to hold it, but we shall return, or I shall return. Yes, sir.
Do you think that Churchill had a legitimate grievance was very concerned about losing Poland? And how is it that Poland went to the Soviet Union, and did Roosevelt have a part in it?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and as we have a Polish delegation at this weekend, very apposite. Again, there isn't a simple answer. Churchill knew as well as President Roosevelt that it would be very, very difficult, given the collapse of the British. It was impossible for the British to pursue them, although the British had declared war on Hitler because of the German invasion of Poland. It would actually be completely impossible for the British to defeat Hitler once France fell in 1940 on their own, and that's why Churchill pursued the alliance with the United States. But I don't think Winston Churchill ever dreamed that the United States and Britain together could liberate Poland, given the strength of the Germans in 1942 and then 1943. I mean, it simply wasn't on the cards that they could defend, that they could protect, could invade and protect Poland against Soviet forces, which were their allies. And so there's been a great deal of discussion about it, because obviously it seems so tragic to sort of surrender to the Russians knowing what they're going to do. I mean, both Roosevelt and Churchill knew that it was the Russians who had murdered tens of thousands of Polish officers at Katyn. And they, in order to preserve the United Nations alliance with the Soviet Union, we had to pretend that the Germans were responsible for the Katyn massacre. But it was quite clear to both President Roosevelt and to Churchill that the Russians were behind it. And there is a source that says that to Cardinal Spellman in New York, Roosevelt had said in the summer of 1943, he was very sorry, but speaking to a Catholic cardinal, as things look, and this is in 1943, as things look, we will defeat the Third Reich, but we will not be able to save Poland, and it may be decades before Poland will become free. A pretty visionary statement, that, I think. One more question. Sir.
Who did influence FDR? You mentioned those who didn't.
Who influenced FDR? Politically, militarily?
Militarily.
People say to me, well, Nigel, you present a new look at FDR as Commander-in-Chief. This is not what we grew up to read in our history books. We tended to think that FDR left the running of the war up to his senior generals, Marshall and Admiral King and General Arnold of the Air Forces and so on. So if President Roosevelt is so strategically wise and patient and far-seeing, how come he never went to military college or naval college like these advisors? How did he know they was talking rot in 1942 and again in the beginning of 1943, pressing for a cross-channel landing, a D-Day that we weren't ready for? And at the end of the day, I'm not sure I can answer that. His command style was very low-key. He didn't give sort of often very direct orders. He liked to allow people to make their suggestions and recommendations. And some people assumed that meant that he couldn't make his mind up. Well, that's rubbish. The reason is, like General Marshall told somebody after the war, sometimes it took me weeks before I would get to see the president, as if the president had more important things to deal with, Congress or, I don't know, butter rationing or something. But that's rubbish. The reason is because the president maintained control of the military by not seeing them every day. Churchill saw his military 5 times a day and was always meddling with the military, and it led to disaster after disaster, really. And if you think of not just the collapse of the British Empire, but even the invasion of Italy and whatever. I think the greatness of FDR is how he rules by keeping his cards all on his own table, and none of these admirals or Air Force generals or army officers, they're told to get on with their job, but they're only occasionally invited to the White House. The President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief of the United States, and to this day he remains, by the U.S. Constitution, the Commander-in-Chief. I think it's a wonderful thing. I managed to interview for this book the last surviving officer from Roosevelt's map room, and Roosevelt was the first president to create a map room, which is the forerunner of the Situation Room at the White House. And he said, well, General Marshall was allowed to come into the map room if the president agreed. So here is the president who doesn't even allow his signals from Churchill and Stalin and ultra-intelligence. He doesn't allow those signals to come in and go out through the same service. They come in through one service, like the Army, and they go out through the Navy. He deliberately didn't want anybody to assume that they had the right to make strategy. Only the President of the United States, and to my mind, thank God he did. He saved us from mass suicide. It was difficult enough, as we heard this afternoon, to get across the Omaha beaches, but we did. What would have happened in 1942 or 43, we can only imagine. How are we doing? Shall we? Is that a good place to So with your help, we can change history. We can change the way we look at the past if you spread the word. The myth that President Roosevelt was standing back and letting the military run the war is a myth. And I think we have every reason to be grateful to President Roosevelt, not only for the strategy he laid down, especially unconditional surrender, but also his choice of General Eisenhower to be Commander-in-Chief in the Mediterranean and the Supreme Commander. Thank you again.